Hi, everyone. Thanks for coming out. I'm Chris. A lot of familiar faces, couple new ones. Um, yeah, thanks for coming out to my chat today. I talk to you guys a little bit about the microbiology of beer spoilage. I'm gonna walk you guys through a couple case studies of spoilage incidents that we help some breweries solve. Go over, how they happened, how we solved them, and what the costs around all of that look like. So first, I just want to give a little introduction to our Raft team. We got me on the far side, followed by Danielle and Ewan, who are here at the conference. So if you see them around, go say hi. And then on the other side, we have Aya and Angela, who are holding down the fort at the lab, making sure that all the beer we watch over is doing okay. I also want to give a little second to let you guys know that in this same room at noon, Ewan and Ren Navarro are going to be speaking, and it's a talk you're not going to want to miss. So be sure to stick around after. What we do at Raft is we act like your QC lab. We make sure that you guys are saving your time and money on quality control so that you can spend more time brewing beer by acting like your lab, and making sure that these lab plans that we run for you are tailored towards the work that you need done and the budget that you have. So we're going to get into a little bit about why beer spoils, how that happens. First of all, let's talk a little bit about why beer doesn't spoil. There's a lot of stuff that stands in the way of beer spoiling. So first of all, there's the boil and other process steps that help keep a lot of microbes at bay. And then there's the composition of the beer itself with the hops, the pH, the ethanol, the anaerobic environment. There's not a ton of microbes that can live in beer, but there are a couple, some bacteria, some wild yeasts. And they're usually getting into breweries through old, broken, damaged brewing equipment, ineffective CIP processes, and biofilms building up. So at Raft, we mostly get great beer. We work with a lot of clients who make really, really great beer. And once in a while, we also get a lot of bad beer, stuff that's gushing, stuff that's spoiling, stuff that looks like volcanoes and that's exploding. And we make it a bit of a tradition for new staff members to get to destroy any spoiling product. So in this first video, we have Aya stabbing a can of very pressurized beer with an X-Acto knife taped to the end of a broomstick. And these make for some really, really cool footage. Here's Ewan throwing another spoiled can against a wall. And our newest hire, Angela, is probably going to have the opportunity to do this later today because we found some cans with wild yeast in them that are starting to balloon a little bit. So I'll have new videos for this slide later. So when we talk about like the context of this problem, I'm sure a lot of you guys in here have experienced spoilage yourself, even if you don't want to say it. But the fact is there's a ton of beer on the market that has spoilage bacteria in it. We've done a ton of analysis, and over again, we're finding that about 20% of the beer on the market has spoilage microbes. When we look at the risks around spoilage microbes, there's some obvious one like the lost product, whether that's happening in the facility and you're catching it earlier, or you've already put this stuff out to market and now you're also facing recall costs. There's tons of time that's lost in production to solving these issues and, brewing beer that ends up down the drain. Lost sales are also a really important factor in risks due to spoilage. So we ran some analysis back in 2021 where we surveyed a bunch of consumers and a bunch of breweries about off-target beer. And we found that consumers are saying 85% of the time that if they taste a beer that's off, they're going to avoid it for at least a month, and that 31% of them are going to avoid it for at least a year. So that can add up to a lot of lost sales and lost customers overall too. Within that, if you're putting beer out to the market that's not so great and your accounts are getting bad feedback, you could lose those spaces. Also, if you're losing a lot of production time and can't keep up, because you're dumping so much beer that you can't fill shelves. You might miss out on a lot of shelf space opportunities. And there's also the fact that these issues can become systemic if they're not dealt with quickly, which exacerbates all these problems. There's a lot of lost opportunities with awards or recommendations. And back in our 2021 analysis, we were finding that the average 2,500 hectoliter craft brewery is losing at least $18,000 a year to known quality issues. Those numbers don't account, obviously, for the inflation that we've seen in the last couple of years. They don't account for any recall costs. They don't count for any unknown issues. And they don't account for the fact that we also know that consumers are not only avoiding that brand, but your whole brewery for a long time as well. So what you can do to protect yourself is be proactive. You should be doing some regular microbiological analysis in your brewery. And that can look as small or as big as you want it to be, but you should definitely be doing something sometimes so that you have the most data available to you when you are running into issues, that you can track it back. Another thing you're going to want to keep looking at is keeping records in an effective way that you can go back and track all these batches if you're running into issues and all of a sudden you can't figure out where you pitched yeast when into what tank and you can't track back any of your batches. You're having to hunt down your whole brewery to figure out where these issues started. You're also going to want to make sure to have really clear go, no-go targets and procedures. If you're ever running into issues, you should know what the next step is so that you're not jumping to conclusions and losing beer that could be fine, or that you're sending stuff out the door that could be problematic. So now I'm going to dive into some of these stories. The first one that we're going to start with is a time that dozens of skids of packaged beer started smelling like diaper and had to be destroyed. And we got called in to help them solve this problem before it happened again. So working through the process, first of all, this brewery was going through opening up some old batches of their beer. It was about maybe a month and a half, 2 months old. And they thought that someone had farted in the room. Then they realized it was the beer and they called us. So we ran a bunch of analysis across their tank farm and in their cans, and we're finding that this was batch-wide spoilage in the brands that were affected, but not every single brand was affected. So we worked with them to help identify all the batches that were problematic and get them out of there and help them figure out which ones could keep moving forward. Then we worked our way backwards to figure out where this issue started in the first place. In the end, we found a faulty check valve on one of their CO2 lines leading to their bright tanks, where beer was backing up into the system and causing spoilage. So we should talk a little bit about how Megasphere spoils beer. It's causing all sorts of terrible off flavors that no one likes to smell. Probably one of the worst spoilage smells you'll ever experience. And it doesn't leave you. It stays on your hands and you shower and it doesn't go away. If anyone smelled it before, you know what I'm talking about. Some things that we know about Megasphere: it can survive on brewery surfaces without causing problems for a long time. It won't necessarily affect all your batches, so it can be hard to track down because the composition of the beer makes a big difference as to whether it will spoil or not. Things like the ABV and the pH are really important to look at. You're going to find Megasphere in low oxygen places. So typically these are related to packaging line or the bright tank. Anywhere where you have a CO2 line, you should be checking those, making sure that they're not backing up with beer for one. If they look dirty, replace them. These types of hoses are really inexpensive to replace, so just do it. The next story I want to talk to you guys about is a time when half a summer's worth of beer went sour. It all had to be recalled. The brewery had to shut down for 4 weeks to solve this issue. Prior to this issue, they weren't doing any microbiological analysis. After this issue, they definitely are. Okay, so here's what happened during this story. We went to visit this brewery about a year and a half before we ever got a call from them, and we were finding diacetyl in some of their beer, which can be caused by a number of things, but we had a slight suspect that this might be a microbiological issue. A year and a half later, they called us. It was the middle of summer, and this slight diacetyl problem had turned into full-blown spoilage in packaged beer on the market. So we went in to help them out. We looked everywhere around the brewery, all the cans. We were testing everything, every process point, and we're finding this spoilage microbe everywhere, in everything, on everything. I think the only place that was clear of it was the packaging line. So we worked with this brewery. We locked down all these bad batches, and we started to work backwards to figure out where it was starting. Like I said, we started at the very end. We were looking at the canning line, the kegger, going back into the brights, the filtration system, and the FVs, and it led us all the way back to the heat exchanger. In the end, there had been a malfunction, 2 years to any of this beer spoiling, where grain got diverted into the heat exchanger, and slowly over time, biofilms were building up with lactic acid bacteria. And the populations grew and grew and grew, and were going into every single beer through the wort. And eventually, over time, these populations were large enough to cause spoilage. This is what that heat exchanger looked like. So lactic acid bacteria is kind of interesting. The fermentation process of lactic acid bacteria is actually quite similar to yeast fermentation. They're both anaerobic processes, and they're using the same starting materials. They both go through glycolysis, but the difference here is at the end. Rather than getting ethanol, you're getting lactic acid, which is causing the souring and the off flavors and things like that. So what did this do for the brewery? Well, they had to recall and dump several batches that were both in production and on the market. They lost 4 weeks of production time in the middle of summer, and the lost sales, like you couldn't even probably measure how much that cost. But in the end, it was certainly enough money to put down any brewery, put them right out of business. The next story I want to talk about has a happy ending. It had a rough start, though. This brewery was seeing half of its batches exploding on shelves. This was 2 months before they had to enter beers into the CBAs. And in the end, they won Brewery of the Year. So this brewery was seeing these beers exploding on shelves, not every single beer, and they weren't finding anything weird in their facility. It seemed like everything in tank was fine. So we came in and we sampled everywhere again. And we found wild yeast in about half of everything we sampled across the fermentation vessels and the cans. So through that process, we were able to identify the batches that were able to be moved forward and continue on through production, while locking down the ones that were problematic and trying to solve this issue. Again, we worked upstream through the process, and this time it landed us at a yeast brink that had a crack along one of the welds and was just introducing really small amounts of wild yeast. So every batch that was found to have this wild yeast issue was tracked back to yeast pitches coming from this yeast brink. A little bit on how wild yeast are spoiling beer, particularly diastatic yeast. They have an extracellular glucoamylase, which is just really long words for, they have like a little machine that they can spit out that can go attack these large complex sugar molecules like starches and break them down into smaller sugars that yeast can eat and make more alcohol and unfortunately CO2 with in your beer that's packaged. So really small concentrations of wild yeast have the ability to grow into really large populations because they can do this to your beer when it's in package. Wild yeast can get into your facilities in a number of ways, but one common way is through some cross-contamination if you're using known diastatic yeast strains or if you have any like wild fermentation or barrel programs. So one thing that you want to make sure of, especially if you have a barrel program, is to treat every barrel as a separate vessel so that you're not putting diastatic yeast into what would have otherwise been a great batch of beer. And whenever you're working with known diastatic yeast, treat it like a spoilage organism and make sure you're running really effective CIP programs. So when we look at the costs of something like this, there's obviously the cost of all the dump batches and the recalled beer off the shelves. But one of the big costs here was that they nearly missed the opportunity to submit clean batches to the CBAs, which would have cost them Brewery of the Year. If this problem had not been resolved quicker, they might not have won this huge award. My next story is interesting because in the end, there was nothing wrong at all. But this brewery thought there was something wrong. They were dumping their entire farm because they were running some PCR analysis and finding some scary results. So in-house, they were running PCR analysis with one of the PCR kits, and all sorts of stuff was testing positive for lactic acid bacteria. They couldn't figure out why, where it was coming from, so they called us. And we checked in and confirmed that, yeah, you're finding the DNA of lactic acid bacteria, but there wasn't any live bacteria that was capable of spoiling these beers. So they'd been dumping all this beer on the thought that there was lactic acid bacteria in it, when in the end, there wasn't really any problem at all. To make sure, though, we looked through all of their batches that were in tanks and the stuff that was on the market to make sure that nothing was a problem. And in the end, they didn't have to recall anything, but sadly, they'd already dumped a bunch of stuff. So after this, they brought us in to do their testing for them, trusting the experts. The real whodunit in this case is, I guess, maybe fear, jumping to conclusions. It's really great to have all this data, but you want to take a measured response when you're finding any issues in your facility. So that means following up with some next steps to make sure that what you're seeing is true and that it's like figuring out what the impact is going to be for you so that you can make good business decisions. In the end, what they lost here was a bunch of beer that would have been totally fine. They had to stop some can distribution because they didn't have enough in production to fill those spaces. And this was all happening in the summer. So again, the amount of lost sales, we don't even know. This is my last story. It's about a time when cans and kegs were showing signs of re-fermentation. It was a very costly recall, and it wasn't wild yeast. So this brewery had made a fruited beer. The packaged product was building up massive pressure pretty quickly, about a couple weeks after production. We went in to sample and we were ruling out everything. There wasn't wild yeast, there wasn't any bacteria, their fan was fine, residual sugars looked okay for this beer. It was on target with pretty much every other batch of this beer they'd made before. So to make sure that this problem wasn't rampant in this brand in particular, we checked the batches that they'd made previously and the batches that they'd made since, and we weren't finding this problem in any of them. The only thing that we could find in this beer was brewing yeast, and the concentrations were high and getting higher. So we worked with this brewery to go through their recipes and their processes to see what made this beer different from all the other batches. And in the end, we'd found out that they'd made a pectinase addition during conditioning to help improve the clarity of this beer. This is something that they had just started for the first time in this batch. And in all the future batches after this, they had added this pectinase enzyme much earlier in the process. What pectinase does is it breaks down pectin, which can be a common source of haze and like gelling type issues, like filtration issues in fruited beers. And pectinase can break down pectin, so it's not causing those types of problems. And at the same time, it's giving the yeast galactose to eat, which can cause re-fermentation. In the end, they had to recall this full batch. which was very costly. And several of their accounts were pretty upset about all of this beer that was re-fermenting. So that's it for my stories, but I'm going to give you guys a little bit more info. If you're suspecting spoilage, you're going to want to review your records to track affected batches. It goes back to my point earlier that you're keeping effective records in the first place so that you know what's happening around your brewery. You're going to want to make sure you're quarantining any suspect batches. Don't keep moving them around. And you're probably going to need to expand the scope of your testing because these problems are usually bigger than you think. And if you're having any issues, definitely call us. The main point I want to stress here, though, is prevention is key. All of these stories could have been avoided in the first place if there had been regular microbiological testing happening in the first place. So you want to solve these problems before it's affecting your beer, especially if it's on the market, to avoid all these costs. At the same time, you have confidence in everything that you're sending out the door, and you can build a quality program that's fitting your needs and your budget. That's all from me today. Thank you for being here. If you're concerned about spoilage, definitely come talk to me. If you're just curious about QC stuff in general, visit our website, come talk to us. We're happy to help. Can I take any questions? Oh, yeah. Yep. Is it still on? Yeah. We do a lot of different microbiological analysis to work with breweries. We do lots of forced fermentation, things like that. The key for our clients that are most successful in dealing with microbiological issues is the consistency. They have the data to back up, everything they're doing. If we find any spoilage microbes showing up at any point in the process, it's pretty quick to track them down and deal with the issues. What that looks like in terms of testing is pretty basic. It's mostly like plating and things like that. Yeah. That's a really good question. The packaging line is a big one. We've done some other analysis looking at, spoiled beer on the market, and we're finding like maybe about half of it is occurring up at the packaging line. And we see that through sporadic spoilage. Yeah. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Yeah. Let's go back to chapter 2. Wort heat exchanger. Yeah. Yeah, that's a tough one. Making sure your CIP processes are like up to date is a really good one for your heat exchanger. That's both checking that your chemical levels are right and that you're running CIP in both directions. What you can do if you're suspect of this in the first place, I guess, is making sure that you're doing regular sampling at your heat exchanger and not just later down in the process. Yeah. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. It can vary a little bit on the situation. If someone's really pressed and like they've got the motivation to solve this right away and we can sample everything everywhere as fast as possible, like we've solved these problems in a week, 2 weeks. It can be a little bit more drawn out if someone's trying to be a little bit more cautious and wants to look at everything one at a time. But yeah, it can be really fast too. Yeah. That's a good question. I don't know if I have a good answer for that. Like clearly at least every year, because if these guys had done it once a year, they would have fixed this. But on the other side of that, I know that taking apart a heat exchanger is really complicated and annoying, and putting it back together can cause problems if maybe there wasn't one before. So I wouldn't do it unless you're ready to. And definitely try the CIP stuff first. Yeah. 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 Fan is really important in your brewery in a lot of different process steps. How it's involved in spoilage is excess fan essentially allows things like wild yeast and bacteria to grow better, because they need it to metabolize to grow. So if you can keep your residual fan levels lower, you're putting yourself at a lower microbiological risk. And if you guys don't really know what I'm talking about fan, definitely come find me later because it's something you should all be paying attention to. Which one do I like more? Um, yeah, we do both. We work with clients to, get the data that they want. So some clients just prefer plating, some prefer qPCR, some want absolutely everything, some want even more specialized stuff that we do for them. Um, I think, in my risk averse way, do it all. Uh, if I had to pick one, I don't know. I would say, yeah, I like them all. There's not a big difference to me. I mean, there are, I guess I should say there are different outcomes. There's some bacteria like Megasphaera that are really hard to plate. So they're like more specialized analysis is definitely a better option. But things like lactic acid bacteria and wild yeast grow really well on all sorts of different media. Yeah. 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 You can use different methods to confirm each other too. Yeah. Yeah, that's a really good question. I think a really good place to start is, with your flagship brand or with your highest risk brands. Checking in on those every couple batches once a month is a really good idea. Definitely microbiological analysis is number one. That's the first thing I would cross off. Um, Residual fan analysis, like I said, is also a really good idea. Um, if you want to make sure you're on your targets, like it's good to check in on things like ABV, but I would number one start with micro. Yeah. Any other questions? Okay. Well, if you have one that you think of later, come find me or Ewan or Danielle. Thanks, everyone.